It's time for Truth About Markets with Max and Stacy on Resonance 104.4 here in London. Okay, Stacy, what's happening?
First of all, I want to call your attention to an article which should tell you to question more and to doubt your own media, right? To ask what sort of biases do they have. Remember, here in the UK, they say the media is totally neutral, and this is Ofcom regulated, that they have to be neutral, as if that is possible. So here's a headline from Business Insider. The world really wants this rumor of Vladimir Putin dating Rupert Murdoch's ex-wife to be true. So there's on Friday, I think it was, or Thursday, there was suddenly a story from a U.S. magazine that Rupert Murdoch's ex-wife Wendy Dang was dating Vladimir Putin. But as they point out in this article, they mention that true or not, the public and the UK media in particular really seems to want the pair to be dating. Twitter would not stop buzzing about it. But then they go on, as soon as I saw that, I said, well, that seems highly unlikely because he only speaks to Russian people. His circle of friends is Russian, and he never leaves the country. And then sure enough, Business Insider goes on to point that very thing out, is that, in fact, they've now deleted that. But last night they had on there that, local analysts in Russia say he only speaks with Russian people, has Russian friends, and he never leaves the country. So the fact that the UK media wants to believe this and they're looking for any way that this could possibly be true, it just shows you that on a geopolitical sort of scale, they're so blinded by this obsession with Putin himself. Like, rather than Russia, they're just obsessed with this man. And maybe it's the topless photos of him that he kept on publishing. Maybe this was his intention.
Well, two things. The media here, they go by this rule of impartiality. And to understand that, you have to understand, or in the context of whittling. I don't know if you're familiar with whittling.
No, never heard of it.
Whittling is you have a piece of wood that you pick up from the forest, and you have your pocket knife.
Oh, okay.
And you start to whittle. So you start to shave off the little nubs and little branches, and you're trying to make it into a straight stick or whatever, and you notice that it's a little bent here, a little bent there, and you whittle, and then it's all gone. So that's kind of how stories end up in the UK press. They start off with a story, but instead of reporting the story as it is, warts and all, and this is what's happening, this is the news, they attempt to whittle it down to what they consider to be a standard of impartiality, and by the time it gets on the air, it's nothing there. It's just ersatz. It's gone, and that's why so few people actually watch UK media and pay attention to the UK media. Which brings us to point number 2, which is that here you have Russia, which has just basically asserted itself as the only statesman in the world, and in Syria and in Ukraine, which are considered to be global hotspots. So here in the UK, people really want to know about who this guy is, who is solving these problems, who's showing greatest statesman-like, tendencies since we've seen in decades. So the only way you can introduce him to this audience is through a made-up kind of lurid scandal, because that's how people frame the news. In other words, it's not real until it's framed as celebrity gossip. So people really want to know who Vladimir Putin is. So unless they frame it as celebrity gossip, it's impossible to talk to somebody about, for example, 99 out of 100 people here would not know anything about Syria, anything about Ukraine, anything about the global economy, anything about anything. They only watch celebrity gossip. So in order to try to introduce this guy to a supine tending toward obesity, not very bright population here in the UK, they have to frame it as celebrity gossip.
And of course, you missed out one of the most important stories that, of course, they don't in the UK ever talk about, and that is Yemen. They do talk about Syria because they want the population to back an invasion. They do talk about Ukraine because they do want the population to back genetically modified seeds there. They do not talk about Yemen because they don't want them to know about that, the war crimes going on there. The 80% of the population in Yemen now relies on UN food and food drops.
Just like in the UK, to get people to eat green vegetables, they introduced green beans and chocolate in a can. That's the mentality here. So, in other words, to get people to pay attention to world events, they have to dip it in the chocolate milk of celebrity gossip, and then hope people eat their greens and try to inform themselves. But it doesn't work very well.
And anyway, I was going to also point out that in Yemen this week, Human Rights Watch was saying that there's evidence of British-made cluster munitions. Remember, the BBC did a very good job at covering the fact that cluster munitions were used in Syria, and they rightly condemned the use because allegedly it's against the law to use cluster munitions because these are the munitions that blow up and like thousands of various parts of the bomb go all over the population, so there's no way to control it. So the BBC did cover that extensively, and they said, look, this is happening in Syria. But what they did not tell you is that they the British government at the same time, which of course you're not really allowed to examine too much here due to these impartiality laws, you're not allowed to cover the fact that they sent these cluster munitions, which allegedly are against the international law. They sent them to Saudi Arabia, who then dropped them on Yemen. So Human Rights Watch found these cluster munitions amongst the civilian population. But on top of that, here's another item that is getting very little attention, other than on Twitter. So Ed Conway tweets, at 7% of GDP, Britain's current account deficit is the biggest peacetime shortfall since 1772. Now, I happened to watch the news last night, Channel 4 News. I didn't see them mention this. I saw them mention Syria for about half of the half-hour show. About 15 minutes was spent on Syria. They didn't mention that the country of the United Kingdom, the nation of United Kingdom, has had the biggest current account deficit since 1772, peacetime. So that should force some questioning about what you as a nation hope. Now, a current account deficit suggests that you are exporting your wealth. Mm-hmm. At the same time, of course, we're seeing the closure of Tata's steel plant, in Port Talbot, Wales, because George Osborne went to the EU and demanded that tariffs on Chinese steel not be raised. There's something like 20% here. In Europe, they're 266% in the US because, steel manufacturing in China is subsidized by the government. It's all state controlled. There's way too much there's oversupply, and so they dump it on the rest of the world. Well, George Osborne refuses to put tariffs on that, which according to allegedly the international rules are that you're not allowed to do this. But here, you're not allowed to have any state subsidies, no tariffs in Europe, but China can do it, and you have to suffer it.
Yeah. Well, this huge current account deficit, it goes back to what we're saying about privatization and deals like, EDF, which is, I relate it to my experience here. I live in a flat in London. I get a bill from EDF, which is a French electric company. And so the UK government sold their electric businesses to a French state pension system because they didn't want a UK state pension folks to get that money. And so when you pay your pension, you pay your electricity bill every month, you increase the current account deficit because you're sending money out of the country. So to make ends meet, the country has to borrow more, and Britain has now a shockingly high debt of over 1.5 trillion pounds, and a big deficit, and a current account deficit, and trade deficit, because the government keeps selling stuff to pay for this debt that the banks incurred, the banks generated. The banks never pay down their debt. In fact, they increase their debt. So it's a flushing of the country down the toilet. But a lot of folks are getting rich who are making that all happen. But again, okay, on the coverage of Channel 4 of what's going on in Syria, I was watching that report. It's very interesting because the report consisted of, you're right, they spent a lot of time on it, like 10 or 12 minutes. It's some grandma from Channel 4 is wandering around ruins in Syria and saying that these artifacts were saved. Never mentions until the very, very end. The last minute, she says, it was a force of Russia and others working with the Syrian military that repelled ISIS. Now, was it ever mentioned that the UK government was supporting ISIS in the first part of this report, along with the US, as an attempt for regime change? No, no, no. It's all about how the artifacts were saved. The implication there being that we, Britain, came in and saved this ancient ruin from being demolished because, we're riding our high horse, and at the same time, fundamentally misrepresenting the story and fundamentally, distracting away from, let's say, this current account deficit story, which is, I think, more important to the actual British person in the audience who would be more interested in that than some lies that the UK government is telling about Syria.
Well, Lindsay Hilsum, she is a really excellent reporter and journalist, and she does travel around to all the hot zones. But the fact is, yes, they did devote half of the program, 15 minutes, to the story, and yet they didn't delve into it. They showed the pretty photos and images, video footage of Palmyra, which is, I think, it is worth it's worth saving. It's worth all the people of the world to save, because this is part of our crucial ancient history of the development of global cultures and empires and movement of people. Palmyra was a crucial point in the Roman Empire and empires before that. So I think it was crucial to save it, and Russia did save it. But the fact is, they spent 15 minutes just showing the images and talking about the brutality that happened there by ISIS. Had executed 400 people, for example, in the Colosseum that was there in Palmyra. But they never mentioned the fact that, as some articles in print media is asking, is like, well, everybody, you could see the satellite images of ISIS arriving in Palmyra, and you could see them blowing up. Remember, we saw the satellite images of them blowing up part of Palmyra. Now, why didn't the U.S. stop them? Because at that time, Russia was not involved in the Syrian conflict, not with their military. So why did the U.S. not strike ISIS? Because remember, at the time, they said they were there in order to strike ISIS. But everybody in the world just watched this slow-motion disaster unfold. So Lindsay Hilsum and Jon Snow back in the studio in the United Kingdom. He's also an old-timer, but a very good journalist. And he did not mention it. No, neither of them mentioned the fact that we allowed ISIS in there to go create this barbaric situation of blood on the ancient stones of Palmyra. I thought that archaeologist, though, was interesting that they spoke to, who said that it actually, we shouldn't fix that bit that ISIS blew up, because this is part of the living history of Palmyra now. It is part of the history in 2,000 years. They'll be able to say this bit was blown up by these crazy guys that, whatever they sought, they sought destruction. And it'll be part of the history, just like the Palmyra that existed before they blew that bit up.
Yeah, but there's this continuum in UK media where it could be Mary Berry from the Cupcake Show, or Monty Don from the Gardening Show, or some grandma on Channel 4 traipsing around Palmyra ruins. There's this continuum in all UK media of these garden-dwelling gnomes, mushroom-worshipping, non-informed druid types who just kind of wander through history and wonder why the upper 1% keeps getting richer and everyone who's working for a living is being slaughtered. They just can't figure it out. I mean, we have great cupcakes, and I'm here in my wellies and my brawly stumbling around some ancient ruin, and I'm growing petunias in my backyard. I don't understand why there's so much horror in the world, and they're the number one proponents of it. They're selling the cluster bombs. They support ISIS. They are financial terrorists. That's where the source is, right? 20 miles within your garden shed is the nexus of terrorism. It's called, right here. So it's just this whole UK pretend fake innocence and fake civility that, well, you only understand it if you live here, and it's so revolting and pathetic.
Exactly. So this 15-minute segment on Palmyra, it was dishonest because it refused. They acted all like, we're free media, we have free press, we're covering this, nobody else is here, we're the first British journalist in Palmyra, and we're covering this for you, we're giving you the information. But they left out a lot of crucial information about our role in allowing ISIS to blow this up, and they refused to. Had it been the U.S. who rescued Palmyra, it would have had a completely different tone, and they would have talked about the amazing U.S. onslaught to liberate Palmyra, and they refused to say and liberate. They refuse to say free.
Right. Or why doesn't the story begin with Russia, along with working with the Syrian army, has saved this town? Why don't they just start it off in an honest way? No.
Wow. So let's talk about the current account deficit. UK current account deficit still at a record high, 7% of GDP in fourth quarter. And it's the most since 1948, but of course 1948 was during post-war. So here, despite all of this austerity, remember, George Osborne tells you that the reason why we have to take away wheelchairs from the disabled is because we need to pay down the debt. And yet, our current account deficit gets worse and worse. So we're importing more than we're exporting, and we're earning less on our investments overseas than what they overseas are investing in our country. But again, the media doesn't tell you, expose this, other than the Kaiser report. They don't mention that all these privatizations, so in the steel factory out in Wales, the British government, George Osborne and David Cameron's government, says they can't nationalize it because that is not capitalism. And yet they're importing steel from China, which is all state produced. Here they say they need to privatize various industries like electrical supply, as Max pointed out. State-owned EDF owns it. So the Channel 4 and BBC Newsnight, they never ever talk about this. They should be covering this every single night. This is a lie. It's a blatant lie that any of these industries have been privatized. They've just been transferred to another government overseas, that they get to collect the revenue. And why is it if the German government and the French government are collecting the revenues, why is it, if it's good enough for them, why is it not good enough for us?
Yeah, exactly. It's because that's propaganda. There's a propaganda initiative about the harmless little old biddy who's tending their garden and making cupcakes, and that they couldn't possibly have a malevolent influence on the world. They couldn't be selling cluster bombs. They couldn't be supporting a government that's firing steel workers left and right and throwing them out into the street and starving them to death and throwing people in wheelchairs off cliffs. No, how could that possibly be when we've got, Richard Attenborough, conversing with caterpillars in the jungle? Don't you understand? We're harmless. We just want to, have our, subsidized porridge and honey and nuts and wander around naked and dog in the park. That's us. We're nobody. Don't worry about us.
So in the meantime, another story. This is from Joel Benjamin and those Debt Resistance UK group. They finally got The Guardian to cover it, but they're the only ones that have covered this. Nobody else has. And the headline reads, "The loans that have left councils impoverished and saddled with debt." Of course, you listening live in some council within London, perhaps somewhere else in the UK. Well, it's likely that your council is impoverished. And remember, your local councils have had their budgets cut by the central government of George Osborne's Treasury. So this is part of the reason why they're throwing people out of their council homes and cutting services to old people. But now they're involved, apparently, in these Lobo loans. And this comes post-financial crisis, by the way, post the revelation of wide-scale financial fraud that had resulted in the collapse of the global economy. So these loans, the Lobo loans, typically long-term from 40 to 70 years, were taken up by as many as 63% of local authorities in the UK as a way of funding services post-recession. For housing associations, many considered Lobo loans the only funding option given the shrinking of grants from the government. The less stable associations had committed to development contracts but were starved of cash. But there's a catch. There's always a catch. The terms may have looked attractive, but for a reason. Many local authorities took a gamble when taking out Lobo loans. If base rate interest rates rose, and most people assumed they would, they'd get a good deal. But if they didn't rise, and many local authorities didn't get a good deal. So as the name suggests, the loan terms aren't set in stone. They're now paying a huge amount of money and going bankrupt on these because interest rates have fallen. Now, they take out these loans without any understanding of the financial risk they're taking, and the government allows them to do it.
Well, remember, Matt Taibbi covered this for Montgomery County, Alabama. Mm-hmm. This is just a variation on the same thing. The deal with any income-producing asset like a bond or a package of loans can be shaped like silly putty into anything you want it to look like, and people buy it because interest payments are something that can be sold, or the absence of interest payments or the interest payment risk and anything associated with that risk is easy to commit mis-selling. So here you have a council that is running a deficit that has interest costs associated with it. And here you have bankers who come with a so-called solution, and they create a fake security that is guaranteed to be a loser. If you remember that movie, The Big Short, I mean, the securities that were being packaged, let's say by Goldman Sachs, were guaranteed losers, and then they made bets against the companies that bought the very products they sold, because they knew that once the customer bought what they just sold them, the customer would die. So they made bets against the customer that just bought the thing that they sold them. So here you have the finance industry selling junk to poor council estates. Then they make bets in various ways against these people. They bank on their destruction and their death and there's no protection against it, because the government. This is how the government funds itself through. This is the primary financial representation of this government and other governments, is to perpetrate this underlying fraud.
So the article points out borrowers thought they were insuring themselves against possible high interest rates, but the derivatives built into the loans meant that the costs were linked to market performance. So borrowers actually pay more when rates fall. So again, this constant, but it's the free markets, it's the free markets, it's the free markets. One thing that free markets rely on, of course, is that both sides of the deal are supposed to know all the information. But
some kind of, the thing is that the way that the top 1% gets richer and richer, as I've said many times before, it's not about making money on their money. It's about reducing the risk of owning that money. So here, the risk of owning bonds has been transferred to these stupid council people who are now going to go bankrupt, just like every other victim of the banking charlatans. And then the mainstream media will try to pretend that there are no victims in banking crimes, and yet these poor council people are going to be hurting quite badly.
So allegedly, it's against UK law actually for councils to get involved in any derivatives contracts, allegedly, just like it's allegedly against the law to sell cluster munitions, like it's allegedly against the law to not report fairly on what's happening in Palmyra. The loans should never have been sold. They are extremely complex financial instruments, and pricing them is far beyond the capabilities of housing associations and local authorities. But also, the use of derivatives by local authorities is potentially unlawful and has been since the 1989 Hammersmith and Fulham swaps case. So I'm assuming a swaps case, of course, bankrupted Greece. I'm sure it bankrupted Hammersmith and Fulham.
You have the statute of limitations, which, let's say, it's roughly 7 years.
There's no statute of limitations here in the UK.
And then there will be. In other words, there'll be a deferred prosecution. There'll be some way to defer any kind of legal proceedings, one way or another. And if it doesn't exist now, they'll simply write that law. And because they can write a law on the spot to serve them, any law that doesn't serve them takes years and years to pass. So, and that's been the history in the last 30, 35 years, is simply defer any kind of legal proceedings that would cost a penny to anybody who perpetrated the crime. So here you have, they've discovered this. So you're thinking, oh, wow, I guess the guys who missold that junk to them are going to be facing some kind of justice. You would be wrong, because they'll tie it up until some equivalent of a deferred prosecution or a statute of limitations kicks in. And the proof is nobody's gone to jail in the last 30 years, even though it's not alleged. By the way, this is criminal behavior. Not to say it's not criminal behavior is erroneous. That's incorrect. Anyone who says that is again not correct.
Well, in the case of Newham Council, the bank they bought the swaps from is RBS, which is owned by the government and the taxpayer of the United Kingdom. So they, in fact, have Newham Council, the Financial Times reports, took out 27 loans at a face value of $563 million. The latest fair value of the loans is $959 million. So they added almost 50% cost buying these so-called derivatives from RBS.
Fraudulently induced. It doesn't just tear it up. But of course that'll never happen, because some friend of Osborne will miss a yacht payment, so no justice there. Well, we're down to our last 20 seconds. Oh, this has been fun. It's on YouTube, by the way, this show. Truth About Markets with Max and Stacy on Resonance 104.4. And it's almost time to say goodbye. We have another freaking 10 seconds to say hello and then goodbye and then hello. But it's time once again to say goodbye, y'all.